Good morning, and thanks for joining us on this St. Patrick's Day. I'm Alyssa Yapel with the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, and you probably know that you're here to talk about Bigfoot with us. This is part 3 of a 4-part series. So if you missed the first 2, you can find those videos on our YouTube page. I'll put the link in the Q&A for you. But if you go to YouTube and search OhioDNR, you'll be sure to find us. And just so you know, the first week we talked about the legend of Bigfoot, and last week we talked about the evidence. This week we are talking about the hunters. I know that our presenters have a lot prepared, so I don't want to waste any time getting started. So I just want to let you know, put your questions in the Q&A box, and we will do our best to answer them today. But I'm going to send it to John from Salt Fork State Park to get started. Go ahead, John.
All right. Let's see. There, all good. Can everybody see that?
No.
Not yet?
Not yet.
We'll try again. I'm going to close the share tray.
You think we'd be used to this virtual world by now?
Yeah,
but...
really, it's just every time. Are we good now? Can anybody see it?
I do not see it, John.
I don't see anything either.
Wondering what the problem is.
Bear with us for just a minute, folks.
Can you at least see my desktop?
I'm not seeing anything.
Because I've got the share tray open. Says not. This one hasn't happened before. Let's see.
Well, oh, here we go.
Is it good now?
Yeah, there we go.
Yes.
Excellent.
I'll be sending it live just a second.
All right.
Perfect.
It's good now?
Yes.
Okay. I've noticed sometimes if I open it through the online PowerPoint, it works better. So, hi everyone. Thanks for joining us again. This is part 3 of our 4-part Bigfoot series, and today I want to cover the hunters, the folks who pioneered in the first Bigfoot and Sasquatch research, and the legacy that they left behind, and kind of the future of that research. So that said, first, I just want to cover really quickly a few things that were brought to my attention from last week and the week before that maybe need some clarification. And I also want to say that, so with these webinars, these are kind of a 101 course. So anything that maybe I left out smaller details, some of it's because just because of time, I'm trying to cram a ton of information into one hour-long segment. And some of it also is also because like my background is not in Sasquatch research originally. This is something that I've kind of grown into. So I apologize if I left out any names or glazed over any facts or anything like that, but I've got a few things. First of all, I talked a little bit about an experience that happened back here in a campground where there was a half footprint cast, and I talked about it, if you watch the second one, how it was a fascinating cast because it would be really hard to fake it. And the gentleman that saw that the creature, so the sighting that happened in a campground happened a year before the cast was taken. The cast is a separate incident in the same area. They're just about a year apart. And I believe that it kind of read that they happened like back to back, like the guy saw a creature and a researcher came out and took the cast. directly after that. So they were actually about a year apart. Not the same, not associated in the same way as in like the cast isn't a year old. It was a fresh cast when they found it. It was just two separate incidents in the same area involving the same folks. So another thing, the big handprint, not the knuckles with the thumb, but the big handprint that I showed with the dermal ridges on the fingers. I wanted to give credit to Paul Freeman for that, for the analysis of all that, and I think I misspoke with that one. Also, one quick thing, there was an image of a possible Sasquatch with a white spot, and I said the white spot. I mistakenly said the white spot was on the inside of the right thigh. It's actually on the chest, the upper chest, is where the white spot was, and it's one of my Bigfoot researchers, which I'll actually talk about today. He actually found references to an animal in that same area, a creature in that same area that's reported to have a white spot on the chest. I was just mistaken. Sometimes, I'm looking at Alyssa and I'm looking at the clock and trying to get through everything, and it's really moving quickly, and I might have misspoke. So I'm trying to cover all my bases, but I apologize if I glaze over anything. I also want to acknowledge Jody Cook, who wrote a fantastic book about Bigfoot encounters in Ohio. He's kind of the person that resurrected the term grassman, and he's a very fascinating character, and we'll talk a little bit about him later on. But I think I misspoke when I talked about the grassman, where that name came from, and who kind of resurrected that term later on. So just wanted to kind of cover those bases really quick. And I also want to say, so this has bloomed into something much larger than I thought it would be. I want to thank everybody for viewing all of these and watching them and sharing them. You guys have done an awesome job. But it seems like people are really interested. So because I can't cover everything in an hour, and I'm always kind of pressed for time, and I like hide slides as I'm going, just to cut things out so we have enough time to answer questions and things. Because so many people are interested, I'm going to start doing probably a bi-weekly like Sasquatch Hour Facebook Live event on our Facebook page, the Salt Fork State Park Facebook page, and Alyssa's going to share the link in the chat for that. You can just like us and follow the Salt Fork State Park Facebook page, and sometime in April, hopefully, I'm thinking the second week in April, I can probably have the first one ready to go. But I'm going to use this as an opportunity to get lost in the weeds, to get kind of into the more nitty-gritty details and really interview these people and try to answer questions that I might have glossed over with this. And I apologize if I have. I'm not trying to offend anybody. Again, like, not my original background. So, and we'll try to get, if we want to talk about dermal ridges and every single print that has dermal ridges, we can do an episode about that. So keep an eye out for that. And we will kind of go into a deeper dive. So moving on. So the early days of Sasquatch research. Now, I mentioned in the previous webinars that the term Bigfoot didn't really come about till the 1950s, but we had all these reports of like mountain devils and goblins and things like that. So there wasn't a cohesive Bigfoot effort. But one of the earliest accounts is from a British Canadian explorer. He was a surveyor and a trapper, kind of a well-educated mountain man named David Thompson. And in 1811, he published a really comprehensive map of kind of the greater Northwest. On here, he traveled 56,000 miles and mapped 1.9 million square miles. That's impressive with no modern mapping tools or anything like that. So anyway, so he was really important not only to he was kind of the birth of, or the earliest Bigfoot accounts that we can find that were written down by like an explorer or something like that, but he was also important to just like the manifest destiny of North America. He he aided in the migration west just by mapping all of this. So in 1807, one of his journal entries outlined 14-inch long tracks that he suspected were woolly mammoths, but that Native Americans who he had spoke to described as a large fur-covered creature that was really hard to spot, and that they kind of shied away from. So he actually recorded these large tracks. We don't know for sure what he was talking about. Again, he didn't, take out his camera phone and snap a picture. This is all journal entries. But he suspected, and I know it seems crazy, the woolly mammoth thing, but Lewis and Clark, one of the things that Thomas Jefferson had told Lewis and Clark to keep an eye out for west of the Rockies were remnant populations of woolly mammoths, because they had been found already. Mammoth remains had been found in the east. They had been found in Ohio and Kentucky. So it was thought that maybe there were remnant populations in kind of the Wild West. So he suspected it was a woolly mammoth, but it sounds like through a modern lens, it sounds awful convincing as a Sasquatch track. So I just wanted to touch on that. This is more of an obscure thing. I want to say this is the birth of the Bigfoot hunter, because he was at least interesting enough for him to note it in one of his journals. So now I know I've talked about Teddy Roosevelt before, and he's not explicitly a Bigfoot hunter. I'm going to call Theodore Roosevelt I'm going to call him an honorary Bigfoot hunter for the purposes of today, because anyone that knows anything about Theodore Roosevelt knows that he was this kind of larger than life character who, when he was serving the New York state government, he had a wrestling ring installed in his office so he could wrestle and box people while he was working. So he was kind of this larger than life character, and he was a big game hunter, which I know is kind of, kind of controversial in modern times, but back then it was part of what made him so charismatic. He was a military leader and an author and a president, but to me, he was a naturalist first and foremost. He compulsively collected things, whether it was plants or bugs, or he writes about hunting trips where he didn't shoot big game. So he would collect, ground moles and document them and make museum skins out of them and collect moths that came into his tent and pin them. So he was, he was a naturalist. Now I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about the bombing incident because I've covered it, I think, in 2 other webinars. But he wrote it down in a book. A trapper told him stories about a big unclassified creature that actually, had violent encounters with man. And Roosevelt refers to it as a goblin in some of his writing. So the reason why I've included him is because we can very easily picture Theodore Roosevelt in a tent in the snowy northern part of Montana, fantasizing about finding a Bigfoot, fantasizing about squaring off with this monster in the wilderness. And that's why I included him, because we can very easily, he's kind of my honorary Bigfoot hunter here. So that's kind of where we're at with Bigfoot. But moving forward into kind of what we would consider the modern times, we have what have been referred to as the 4 horsemen of Sasquatchery. I didn't coin the term Sasquatchery as much as I wish I would have. I did not. That's not my term. But the 4 horsemen of Sasquatchery. You could not have written a piece of fiction with 4 more well-suited characters for this sort of thing. You have kind of the lofty professor. You have the big game hunter. You've got sort of the humble enthusiast, and then like a smooth-talking reporter. I mean, it's like a dream team. You could not have written fiction with a better cast of characters. So it really is fascinating to learn about these guys. So the first one I want to talk about is kind of the enthusiast. He has an interesting kind of colorful life. It's Rene de Hinden. He was a researcher. He was a Swiss Canadian, an outdoorsman, He has an interesting background. I mean, he was this after he got kind of somewhat famous for the Bigfoot research that he did. He became a spokesperson for a regional beer that's up there. So for about a year, he was kind of the spokesperson for a regional beer in the area. So he's an interesting person, but he was one of the major advocates of the Patterson-Gimlin film, and I had heard it may have been on Laura's podcast that and I've got no facts to back this up, but the Patterson-Gimlin film has been analyzed it's only second to the Kennedy assassination film. So it's been analyzed and analyzed and analyzed, and it's still kind of shrouded in this fog of mystery. He was one of the major advocates. He looked at it and really believed it was real. He was also involved with, and I know I've talked about this one, the Bossberg, the Cripplefoot tracks, and we've talked about the Cripplefoot tracks because, I personally, these ones intrigue me because why on earth would you fake why would you fake something like arthritic or injured toes? This is something, these tracks, the right foot was normal and how you would expect it. The left foot is all distorted and it's been broken and it's got like arthritic, broken, gnarled toes. It would take a lot of creative forethought to hoax a medical condition associated with this. That said, he was also involved. Some of the things that he researched, he actually debunked a lot of hoaxes. So he kind of, he looked at things. There was an incident where some local businessmen had claimed that a Sasquatch had been shot and injured and had died in a mine shaft, and that its body was there. I mean, he was the one that kind of debunked that because he recognized early on that in order for anything like this to be taken seriously, there has to be no doubt in there can't be hoaxes. Hoaxes can't infiltrate the actual research, and it's a huge waste of time if a researcher is researching something that someone fabricated in their garage. And again, if I'm glazing over details, it's not because I don't think they're important. I promise. It's just because I've got a lot to cover. So if I'm not going right into telling you which mine shaft it was, or how that hoax was perpetrated. It's just because of time constraints. But yeah, he was an interesting character, and he was kind of the, this was a situation with these four guys, perfect time, perfect place, perfect environment for this sort of thing, but he was spent 40 years searching, and well documented search. So he was definitely a Bigfoot enthusiast. I feel like a connection to Rene Dahinden because he was not a big game hunter, he was not a professor. He was like an enthusiast who thought it was interesting. I feel a connection to that because, again, my background's not in Bigfoot research originally. So I definitely feel a connection with this one. So moving on. So the other one, the smooth talking reporter, charismatic fellow, John W. Green. He was an investigator and a reporter. He wrote one of the better books that I've read, the Sasquatch, The Apes Among Us. It's one of my favorites so far. And that's another thing that I would like to say is after next week's webinar, I'm going to try to cobble together a resource list that maybe Alyssa can post, in the chat or someplace, so that the things that I'm using as resources, the books and documentaries and podcasts and things that I am using as resources, you can use. But this is one of them. He investigated the Bluff Creek tracks and did a really thorough job reporting those Bluff Creek tracks. And I've talked about the Bluff Creek tracks before in previous webinars. But one of the big advocates for he was kind of the PR person for the early Sasquatch movement, I guess, is what I should say. And one of the investigators that I work with here has found old newsletters that have letters written to the newsletter. You know, they were like cyclical newsletters. There are letters that people like John Green wrote actual letters to contribute to the newsletter, and they're not like, they weren't like paraphrased. They were actual letters that he wrote to submit, which is fascinating. You know, these are newsletters from like Ohio Bigfoot research organizations, and he, you know, he wrote in. So yeah, he was a fascinating character too. Like I said, he was by far he was a good like PR person for the early days of Sasquatch research. And I mean, the early days of Sasquatch research, you know, it's a fascinating thing. You know, the idea of mountain gorillas would have you know, lost you your tenure at one point if you were a teacher at, you know, a major university. However, after they were discovered, you know, they became commonplace. And I kind of feel like, while Sasquatch is a big deal right now, if tomorrow we would come across one that got hit by an 18-wheeler, and the Smithsonian came and identified it, and it was proven that it was a new species of bipedal hominid, I feel like within 10 years it would be just as commonplace for us as the mountain gorilla. You know, it would be a big deal for a couple of years. Large swaths of land would get protected, and then it would become just another animal, and it would become commonplace. So that's kind of what we're trying to do now, is remove some of the taboo around the Sasquatch research, because it's, you know, it's a fascinating subject, and he was certainly one of the early investigators to you know, advocate for real science and advocate for solid reporting on these incidents. And he was just a good face for the early Sasquatch movement. So I say this is Peter Byrne. He's he was born in Ireland in 1926. I say presumably still alive because as of 2019 there were interviews with him, but he seems to be a ghost. Even his Wikipedia page is like blacked out. I can't find a whole lot of biographical information about him, which kind of suits him, I think, from what I have read and heard about him. But I can't for sure find. I think he's probably 95 years old now, and I'm assuming he's still alive because there's no death date on any of the information that I could find. But he was really he's a really fascinating character, kind of an Indiana Jones type. You know, he's like a big game hunter, and he's just got a colorful history. So after World War II, he was in the Air Force. He rescued down planes in the Indian Ocean. After World War II, he became a trophy hunter in India and Asia. And through his experiences with locals and hearing stories, he began searching for the Yeti. He was searching for the Yeti in Asia until the late 1950s, when an interesting character, like, again, you really can't make this stuff up because it's almost too perfect. An American kind of oil baron and businessman named Tom Slick, you know, the Patterson-Gimlin film had happened. There's all this buzz around Sasquatch in North America and the Pacific Northwest. So this oil baron named Tom Slick, he looked up Peter Byrne and said, "Hey, I'm willing to fund these expeditions to find the North American Yeti, to find the Sasquatch." So, you know, that kind of brought him to North America. But prior to that, before that, he was tasked by Tom Slick to find proof of the Yeti in Asia. And in a monastery, I talked about this in the last webinar, I think. There was a monastery that had a hand and a scalp of a supposed Yeti, or reported Yeti. And this story is absolutely fascinating. Peter Byrne was tasked with getting this hand for analysis. Now, back then they didn't have DNA. Back then it was literally they were going to take it to like a primatologist or a mammologist and say, is this something we already know of? So he was tasked with stealing this hand, and they replaced it with a mummified hand from a human corpse. And they stole a finger. They couldn't steal the whole hand, but they stole a finger and they replaced it with this mummified, shriveled human finger. And it just so happened the actor Jimmy Stewart was staying in a hotel at the time. He was Tom Slick had tasked Jimmy Stewart and his wife to smuggle this Yeti finger back to the United States, and the Jimmy Stewart's wife hid the finger, this supposed Yeti finger, in her lingerie case, which would have been locked. Back then, it had its own special case and it would have had a lock on it. As they were traveling, the lingerie case came up missing, and British Customs shows up at their hotel door with, is this your lingerie case? And the interesting thing is, she says, "Oh, this is still locked. Did you not go through it?" Because they assumed, the Customs had it, that they were going to go through it looking for something. And he said, "Oh, a member of the British Customs would never, ever open a lingerie case." So it's a very fascinating story, but that was the Ponbach hand. I think it was later found to be an orangutan hand, something, or maybe an Asiatic black bear paw. But it's also, the theory behind it is that it may have been an actual Yeti hand at some point. It just disintegrated over time, and to sort of memorialize it, they replaced it with kind of a replica, which you see throughout history, even like within the Catholic Church, you see like replicas of relics and things that were meant to symbolize the relic. So it's not beyond the realm of possibility that, even though it was tested to be an Asiatic black bear, maybe they made it look like the Yeti hand to kind of memorialize what they used to have. So we're just not sure. There's a lot of controversy around that one. So Peter Byrne had a camp set up near Willow Creek, which is another hot spot for Sasquatch activity in the Pacific Northwest. And that was kind of his base of operations until, unfortunately, I think he worked with Tom Slick and was funded by Tom Slick for like 3 years. And then Tom Slick died in an aircraft accident, like an aircraft crash. And he ultimately returned to Asia for a while and then came back to North America. But he also investigated the Patterson-Gimlin footage and concluded that it was real for a lot of the reasons that we've covered on these webinars, the musculature, the way it walked, those things. So, he was one of the, along with the other folks that we talked about, he's one of the guys that first really acknowledged that it was a real film. So now the next fellow that I'm going to talk about, this is where we're bringing in Laura, and I'll kind of introduce her in a moment. But the next fellow that I'm going to talk about, this is Grover Krantz, and I've got a quote directly from Laura's podcast here. Grover Krantz was and is kind of a big deal. He really is kind of a big deal. So to explain why he's a big deal and kind of the background behind this and how Laura got involved, I'm going to turn it over to Laura Krantz. She's a journalist and a podcaster of the Wild Thing podcast. I can't recommend it highly enough. Both seasons were amazing. So I'll turn it over to her to kind of talk a little bit about Grover and talk a little bit about her background and how she got involved in this strange, wide world of Sasquatch research. So with that, are we good to turn it over?
Hi. I can hear myself. That's weird. Okay, I think the echo stopped. Hi, I am Laura Krantz, and you would think that if you had a researcher of such fame as Grover in your family, you would know about him. And I did not. I was living and working in Washington, D.C. This would have been back in around 2006. And I happened to be flipping through the newspaper. And there was this huge spread in the Washington Post about this guy named Grover Krantz. And some of these photos that are up on the screen right now are actually the photos that that were up on the screen were
Trying.
photos that were in the actual newspaper. And, you know, there was this big exhibit at the Smithsonian that was going up. It was going to showcase Grover's bones and the bones of his dogs. And this was like a 3-page spread. So I started reading it. And at the very end, there's just this kind of throwaway paragraph that talks about how Grover used to drive around the Pacific Northwest searching for Sasquatch with a spotlight and a rifle. And I was like, whoa, this guy's a complete weirdo. Like, first of all, he's saving the bones of his animals, then he's donating to the museum, then he's donating his own bones to the museum, and he also looked for Sasquatch. And he had been born in Utah, which near Salt Lake City, which is where my dad's family was from. So I called up my dad and I asked him, do you know who this guy is? And he's like, I don't think so. Let me ask your grandfather. And my grandfather was like, yeah, that's my cousin. He used to show up at the family picnics with calipers and measure people's heads. So this was a guy who was fascinated by science and anthropology and evolution and how humans came to be in their modern form. He just loved all of this stuff. And one of the stories that didn't make it into the podcast was also Grover was about, I want to say 7 or 8 years younger than my grandfather. And my grandfather was in one of the first medical school classes at the University of Utah, and he managed to smuggle the bones, the arm bones of a skeleton out of the anatomy lab to give to Grover because he knew Grover was so fascinated by this stuff. I don't think that is entirely legal, but I think the statute of limitations has probably expired. So I think, and all of the parties involved are no longer with us either. So I think we'll gloss over that. So, you know, here's this crazy story about this guy that I'm related to. I can actually go and see him in the Smithsonian, and the picture of Grover with his Irish Wolfhound, they modeled the Wolfhounds. Are the photos still up on screen? Yeah. So this picture of Grover with his dog, they modeled the exhibit in the Smithsonian after that photo, and it's still up there to this day. If you go to the Smithsonian's Museum of Natural History, it's in the education laboratory. So you can go down there and you can see him still sort of presiding over students to this day. And that, you know, that's pretty cool. And it's a pretty fun thing to trot out at cocktail parties and say, oh yeah, I have a relative in the Smithsonian. Oh yeah, he believed in Bigfoot, ha ha ha. But I kept sitting on this story, and I sat on it for about 10 years, and I didn't really know what I wanted to do with it, but I knew there was something there. And then when I moved to Colorado, I found out that Grover's 4th wife lived about 30 minutes from me. And I thought, okay, Laura, this is a sign. Go down, talk to her, see what she has to say, learn a little bit more about Grover, see if maybe she can put you in touch with some other people, and maybe you have the bones, no pun intended, for a podcast here. And sure enough, Diane was a wealth of information. She knew all kinds of people. She was willing to put me in touch. And I started looking into this world and looking into Grover a little bit more. And to be honest, I hadn't really thought much about Bigfoot. You know, I'd seen Harry and the Hendersons. I had seen the tabloid stories, you know, the lady who's like, I had Bigfoot's baby, things like that. But I just kind of thought of Bigfoot as being a campfire tale. And I assumed that the people who were interested in Bigfoot might have had a couple of screws loose. And I was wrong. Like, I got to meet some fascinating people who do amazing work and look for Bigfoot on the side. And they're basically really curious people who had a question about the world and a question about the natural world. And like Grover, they wanted to be able to figure out more and learn more and find out if there's any real true evidence behind the possibility for Bigfoot. So that was kind of how I got into this whole topic, was this entry point with Grover, and then got to explore a lot of different avenues, you know, our cultural fascination with Bigfoot. Even people who don't think Bigfoot is real are still fascinated by the idea, the psychology behind that, what it is about Bigfoot that really draws us in, and also looking at some of the evidence, talking to some of the people who have spent their lives looking for Bigfoot, including Peter Byrne. I did get to sit down and do an interview with him. As far as I know, he's still alive, but I also have not talked to him in about a year and a half. So who knows? I hope he is. He's got a lot of great stories to tell. And I also got to sit down with Bob Gimlin, and he told me about his experiences with the Patterson Gimlin, the film, and what happened at the time. And yeah, I mean, there's just this whole world of people who have gotten kind of drawn into the Bigfoot environment and like to go out and explore and want to ask this question. So yeah, I think that's kind of the gist of Grover, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Just send it back to you, John.
Oh, okay. I'm trying to. There we go. Is it up on the screen? Are we good? Can you say everything?
Yeah. Did you have any questions for Laura, or am I going
okay.
back to this slide?
So yeah. Do we have? Is there anything on the chat that we need to cover real quick, and then I can ask my questions?
No,
it's also,
I
will admit, it's really hard for me not to like completely geek out talking to Laura, because this has been an interesting journey for me also, and getting to sit down with somebody that got to travel all over North America looking at this. So during your research for your podcast, and during the time that you spent with the researchers, and I loved the episode where you covered what we call the woo. I'm familiar also with the woo side of things. What was, in your opinion, the most compelling evidence, if there was any one thing that you could point to? What was kind of the most compelling thing that you heard or you experienced during your time doing this?
Do I need to wait for it to come back to me?
I think you're good.
Okay.
I think you're good. Yeah.
Okay, great. So I think probably the most compelling thing was really the eyewitness accounts, like hearing these stories from people, especially people who'd had a lot of experience out in the woods and out in nature and had a lot of familiarity with the environment that they were in, to then hear their experience with something so strange that they couldn't place it. That to me was one of the more compelling things to hear. And now I know that eyewitness accounts won't stand up in court and they are not enough evidence in and of themselves, but it was very, very interesting to hear those. I also think that, there's this long history going back to First Nations and Native Americans, going way back generations and generations, of talking about something like Bigfoot, Sasquatch out there in the woods. And when I sat down to talk with Ian Tattersall, who is a human evolution specialist and works at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, he had some very interesting things to say about human evolution and the fact that there are a lot of holes in the fossil record. So there's part of me that wonders if, even if Bigfoot doesn't exist now, it might have existed once upon a time, and we just don't have enough of the fossil record to know if it was there or not. But it may have overlapped with humans, and that's why you have all these stories. And that was kind of one of those moments where I was like, there seems to be more to this than I had originally thought.
All right, thanks a lot. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
All right. So one thing that's always fascinated me, and I kind of want to get your spin on it, and then we can, I can kind of let you go, because I know you only had about an hour. But and we've got to move on also. But one thing that's always interested me is like, so regardless if you're a believer or not in Bigfoot, like why is Bigfoot important? I mean, you devoted a whole season to a podcast to Bigfoot and finding out more about Grover and all of the researchers and things. Like, why do you think in the even we can do it kind of on a more micro level, like why in the American experience, like in the American psyche, why is Bigfoot? Why do you think Bigfoot is important? I mean, I personally, anybody that's talked to me in person knows that I'm kind of on the fence myself about the whole thing. But I certainly believe in like the spirit of Bigfoot, you know, like, so
Yeah.
why do you think, what did you find that maybe why is Bigfoot important to our culture and our history here in North America?
Yeah, I think there are a number of reasons, but I think, you know, the more I've talked about this with people, if you think about human evolution and human society, like we have always grown up, or we have sort of moved through history and moved through time with this idea of there being something out there, something beyond the campfire light, something beyond the city wall, and we've kind of defined ourselves against whatever that is. And so I think we have always evolved with the idea of there being a creature out there, whether it is Beowulf, whether, you know, Epic of Gilgamesh, like there's all these things in literature, there's all these things in history that we have used as a foil, I guess, against our own evolution. And I think part of us, we've sort of evolved with the idea of Bigfoot, or there's something like Bigfoot out there. So I think it's almost embedded into our psyche, our DNA, if you will. I think that's part of it. I think too, we like the idea of something, a world that is wild enough and unexplored enough to hold something like Bigfoot, because if we've mapped every corner of the globe, if we've seen every inch, if we already know where everything is and what all of the creatures are, it kind of takes some of the mystery and the exploration and the excitement of going out into the woods. It takes it away. And that's also something that we've evolved with. Like, we are naturally curious species. We like exploring, we like asking questions, and if all of them are already answered, then what does that leave us with? What do we do now? I think those are two of the big ones. And I think also one last one, and this is one that I heard from a number of people, is it's an environmental, it's a sort of a symbol for an environment. And they want to protect Sasquatch because they want to protect the environment. And they want to protect that wildness and those forests and those places where something like Sasquatch could exist. So even if they don't necessarily think that Sasquatch is out there, they still want to protect the idea that something like Sasquatch could exist there because the environment for it exists.
All right, thank you. Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that statement either. I have often said that I think Smokey Bear should retire and we should replace him with Sasquatch. Thank you so much for joining us. Honestly, I could just talk to you for an hour because I really did. I loved the podcast. I loved the podcast because it was not a podcast desperately trying to convince listeners to believe in Bigfoot. You know, it was a podcast. I thought it was, again, I've listened to quite a few. It's just the nature of this job here at Salt Fork. Like, I'm at the Squatch capital of Ohio, you know. So the nature of the job is finding resources and listening to things, and your podcast was great because you weren't desperately trying to convince me that Bigfoot existed. You were laying out, I mean, it was so well rounded. You did everything from like the Bigfoot merchandise and like the cash crop that is, you know, the cash cow that is Bigfoot, you know. It was fantastic. So I appreciate you so much taking the time. I know it's probably pretty early in the morning there, so I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me and join us on these webinars. I would have never thought these webinars would have been as popular as they are. So having you on, I can't express my gratitude enough. So well, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me, and happy hunting to everyone who is out there looking.
Thanks. Thanks a lot.
Take care. Bye.
Bye. All right. So we've kind of got a good overview of Grover Krantz. So we're going to kind of move on. And I kind of anticipated this, so I've condensed stuff down at the end because I knew if anything I would want to talk to Laura longer. Again, it was really hard for me not to like completely geek out because I'm a big fan. But passing the torch, we covered kind of the old guys. You know, we covered the old guard of the Sasquatch research. You know, it was in Sasquatch's early days when the term Sasquatch and the term Bigfoot were getting thrown around. You know, it was a really fascinating time. Moving forward into like the more modern times, we have folks like this guy in the upper right, hand corner is Dr. Jeff Meldrum. He kind of took over for Dr. Krantz. He's sort of the serious scientific researcher doing research from like an evolutionary biologist's standpoint, an anthropologist's standpoint. He's looking at it from a very logical perspective, and he's kind of right now he's like one of the people who he's got serious credentials, and his work and his writing, it's very, very compelling. You've heard me talk in the previous webinars. If you've listened to those, or if you're going to listen to those, you'll hear me talk about that mid-tarsal break in a lot of the footprints, where the foot flexes in a certain way that would be really hard to hoax. That's a lot of his research. I mean, it's a lot of Dr. Krantz's research too, but Jeff Meldrum, that's a lot of his research, that mid-tarsal break, and like looking how this animal moves, through its environment. So he kind of took over that. Of course, if you've ever seen like Finding Bigfoot or any of those specials, you've got like Cliff Brockman. He's a fascinating character. This guy down in the lower right, I had never heard of him before starting the research for this webinar series, but I wanted to kind of say, I've read quite a few books about Bigfoot and Sasquatch and the evidence and the hoaxes and everything and experiences. Just as part of this job, I have read quite a few books now at this point, and a friend of mine, who I'm going to talk about in the next page, gave me one of this guy's John Bindernagel, and he wrote a book. One second, I want to bring up the actual title. But he's a wildlife biologist, and like an actual wildlife biologist. But he wrote a book called the Discovery of Sasquatch and the North American Great Ape, the Sasquatch. And the North American Great Ape was laid out in a way. It was like laid out exactly how I needed it to be laid out for this webinar series, if that makes sense. It was laid out with like, here's this experience, and we've got all this evidence for this experience. But while most of the books that I've covered have been like, well, here's this experience, and here's what they heard, here's what they smelled, here's what they saw, here's the footprints, here's this. His was here are the eyewitness accounts, here are the footprints, here are the and they were all clustered together, and it was excellent because I could flip through it and find exactly what I needed. And it was, I can't tell you how heartbroken I was when I found out it was out of print and like $150 on Amazon, because it was really an amazing piece of research. And then this kind of grumpy looking character in the lower left, that's Roger Miller. He excuse me, he wrote a book that I have had since I started at Salt Fork. It was the Bigfoot Field Observer's Manual. It's a field guide to Bigfoot, and it really is a great field guide. I wish wildflower field guides would kind of take, at least in the size of it, it's perfectly sized so you can slip into the cargo pocket on your pants or into the back pocket on your pants, and you can carry it out in the field. And it has all of the methods for collecting evidence, how to take eyewitness reports. It's a fantastic book. And he was also a Canton native, so he's a Buckeye. But a lot of fascinating stories, and kind of, these guys are kind of the newer age now. John Bindernagel has passed on, and I don't think that Mr. Miller is active anymore. But Dr. Meldrum, it basically, if you want to, as a litmus test to tell how good the Bigfoot documentary you are watching is, take a look at the credits and see if Dr. Meldrum is in the credits. That's kind of a good litmus test. Like, is this a worthwhile documentary? Because he's like one of the best. And then with the BFRO and everything, Cliff Brockman, he's like the guy to go. He's the go-to guy with the BFRO. I know you've all probably heard me talk about the BFRO already. So as I've done with all the other ones, we're trying to make it kind of telescopic. So bringing it, these are kind of our local legends. And again, I can't fit all of the folks that I've worked with and all of the lovely people who we've met and dealt with here at Salt Fork. These are just kind of some of our local legends. You're all very special to me. So I promise I'm not trying to slight anybody. And hopefully, if any of you are willing to talk to me, if any of you are listening, when we go into these like deep dive sessions later on in April, we'll get together. And all right, so I promise I'm not trying to slight anybody. These are just some of our local guys. Mark Maisel has taken a lot of the reports that I've talked about in the previous webinars. A lot of the reports from Salt Fork and the surrounding areas. He's the guy. He was the guy that was there making the casts, taking the eyewitness accounts. He's helped for a few years. He's helped on and off with our Bigfoot hikes here. Really valuable resource. I'm going to skip 1 second because I have a special thanks to say here in a second. But so we got Amy Boo. She's doing a phenomenal job with a thing called Project Zoo Book. So you can Google that and learn a little bit more about it. But what she is doing is she's trying to strip away all the taboo around Bigfoot research and bring it into like actual modern scientific inquiry. She's taking a look at it and trying to collect evidence that, and it's a phenomenal thing that she's doing, because that train has already left the station. Like the road to serious Bigfoot researchers, it's already there. And she is paving the way for like that, stripping away all that taboo. And then we've got a real local legend here, Don Keating. I mentioned him in the last one. He kind of proposed the idea of the Sasquatch triangle. He's really a veteran Bigfoot researcher. He is a local legend. There are a few names that come up in the Salt Fork area when you talk about Bigfoot researchers, and usually Don Keating's is one of them. And then here, kind of in the middle, we've got Dave Wickham. These webinars wouldn't have been possible without the help of Dave, or Taters, as he's affectionately known. They would not have been possible without him. He's one of the most thorough researchers that I know. I can text him at 11 o'clock at night and say, hey, in the Bindernagel book, they said this. And, a second later, he's going to have either screenshots of researchers or research that he already had on a PDF on his phone, or he'll text me, or he'll call me and explain things. He's been willing enough to give me like good notes on all of this research that I've tried to do. And then here at the park, we couldn't have the Bigfoot hikes that we have if it weren't for folks like Dave and Dave himself. I mean, he's when you see Dave get into his car and get the big tote full of stuff out, you never know what he's going to pull out, but it's always fascinating. It's always things like the plaster casts that he has and all of those. So he will definitely be on one of our he'll actually be, I should say this now, he'll actually be on next week, as well as Mr. Keating, during the second half of our Bigfoot hunt next week, sharing experiences and sharing information. So you'll get to meet both of them. But this wouldn't have been possible. I wouldn't have had the resources had it not been for Dave. So just wanted to thank Dave there. And where they're standing right now, if you watched the last two webinars, where they're standing right now, that's the site of that Hosak's Cave sighting where the footprint was collected, that has kind of the big rock in the middle of it. That's the site of that. So he just does phenomenal work. He's been associated with multiple organizations. He's on multiple podcasts. He's a great guy. I can't thank Dave enough. Again, we wouldn't have the content that I have if it weren't for Dave. But they're all great. Again, I'm so fortunate here at Salt Fork to be associated with these guys and get to know them. And it's not just them; it's multiples. Like I said, if there's any of you listening, and I promise you're all very dear to me. I'm just, it's the time frame, and I would love to have you on later on with some of the deep dive stuff that we're doing. So these are just some of our local legends. So with that, I will take any questions that we have, if we have any.
And actually, we don't have questions today. It's been a
It's
quiet
kind of a different,
person.
this was kind of a different one. So,
Yeah.
you know, I just felt, so you hear it multiple times. You hear it said, like, I know Dave said it to me multiple times, like, you know, I'm standing on the shoulders of giants, and he's talking about people like Dr. Krantz and Peter Byrne, you know. So I thought, as a good way to start to wrap up this webinar series, kind of giving a nod to these guys, to these researchers, was important to me. So while it's been a little different and it's not so such nitty gritty Sasquatch oriented stuff, there wouldn't be any Sasquatch oriented stuff if it weren't for these guys. So that's kind of why I wanted to do this and cover all of this subject. So if anybody has any questions, you know, those will get forwarded to me. I can try to answer them. And like I said, keep your eye out on the Salt Fork Facebook page for kind of our, I'm going to try to do maybe on Wednesdays, that seems pretty successful, kind of do a deeper dive into things where I'll have people like Dave on to answer questions and talk a little bit more about evidence and keep evidence up to date and things like that, and cover anything that, you know, I missed or I got wrong. Again, my background is not in Bigfoot research, so I'm just as new to this as anybody. Yeah, I appreciate all of you watching. The views that we've gotten so far have been phenomenal, so thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to next week's. So
Yeah, thank you, John, and thanks for everybody for joining us. If you want to check out the previous webinars, as we've mentioned, go to our YouTube page, OhioDNR. And if you want to check out future webinars, we have a virtual programming page on our website, so check us out there and you'll see everything that we have coming down the pike. As you know, next week, John's going to be leading a hunt, and we also have some awesome webinars celebrating Women's History Month to wrap up the month of March. So take a peek at those, and happy St. Patrick's Day. Bye.